not sure about recording.
It's being recorded.
It says now it's being recorded. Yes, it's being.
You're connected, Ralph.
Yes. Hello, Jim.
Hey, how are you, Ralph? Welcome.
How's everybody? They're all locked down.
Well, they're locked down in the UK and South Africa. You have quite an audience here. I sent you a list of the people who are here waiting eagerly for your wisdom about the climate and the pandemic. But we have Gail Bradbrook, who is chairman of Extinction Resistance. She's in London. John Christensen, my colleague from Tax Justice Network, chairman of Tax Justice Network. Professor Pogge, Christian Maida, and quite a few others, and students as well, eager to hear. You know, the subject of this is really to try to find intelligent life on the planet Earth. But you know, in the midst of this pandemic, we're also worried about the global climate crisis. And so the focus of this seminar is partly about the facts of the climate crisis, but also about what, from your background and experience, what we should be doing politically about it. So I'm just going to shut up and let you hold forth here.
Well, there's obviously a lot of knowledgeable people on the line. And what's important is to look back when the first warnings in the 1960s and 70s came. And in 1992, I think it was 1992, one of the first things, or 93, one of the first things Clinton and Gore did, they put out a very elaborate publication, maybe 200 pages with graphs and everything, warning about climate change. They called it global warming then. And they had all the recommendations, and then they proceeded to do nothing. In fact, it was worse than that. They gave the auto industry 8 years of escape from improving fuel efficiency standards, which of course reduce some greenhouse gases. And this is by way of saying that the warnings have been all over the place. Hansen, NASA, and people overseas. So the question is, why wasn't the peril communicated in ways that were understandable to ordinary people? And the reason is that the environmental groups are too wonky. They talked about nitrogen oxide and methane and other greenhouse gases. Then they went up to the stratosphere and started talking about climate change. What they should have done, in my opinion, is you first talk about the gross inefficiency of the fossil fuel industry that takes no recognition of its externalities. It's tremendous damage to health, the property, everything from corrosion to broken equipment. It comes from the use of fossil fuels, poisoning of the land, soil, oil spills. And what they should have done is said, look, the reason why we have pollution from fossil fuels is because we're not burning it efficiently. If we burned it efficiently, the consumers would get the benefit. That's a consumer side benefit. Of course, the fossil fuel companies will sell less fuel as a result. So in the power struggle in Washington, who wins? Well, the fossil fuel industry has won. So what the environmentalists should have done, I did this, but you know, I can only reach so many people, is you say, look, the reason to control and replace fossil fuels is, one, it's costing you too much in the pocketbook. Two, compared to alternatives. Two, it's polluting the lungs of your family right here on Earth and damaging other things. Three, by the way, it's also increasing global warming gases, and we got droughts, tornadoes, fires, sea level rises, all other catastrophes on the way. So you start with the perceived self-interest of people in their pocketbook and their immediate health of their children who may have asthma and so on. So the message to this day is not concrete enough to start with kitchen table issues before you deal with reasonable foresight by our generation for future generations. The second mistake that was made was, and this is never questioned adequately, we had rallies, we had marches, we had mobilizations, mostly on weekends in the US, and 1,500 people were arrested in the White House grounds protesting the gas pipeline, led by Bill McKibben. And what was the default here? What was the deficiency? They don't focus on the question, well, who would make the decision to turn the country around systemically from fossils and nuclear to renewable and, very important, immediate savings and efficiency? It's the Congress. The Congress, 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 the Congress. 535 people. So I read a letter in 2014 to George Soros, Al Gore, and Tom, what's his name, Jim, just ran for president.
Tom Steyer.
Yeah, Tom Steyer. It was a joint letter. And I said, look, you're all clued in. Nobody has to persuade you. It's a global crisis. But I go up and down Congress. I don't see one person full-time representing the concerns of climate change people, full-time lobbying Congress. The environmental groups gave up on Congress when the Republicans took control in 2011. They blocked the bill that was passed by the Democrats in the House, and they wrote off Congress. So they dealt with coal emissions and petitions and lawsuits vis-a-vis the EPA and so forth. Now just think of this. To this day, I don't know one person who every day gets up in the morning representing the climate constituency and lobbies Congress. Why? Because they say it's hopeless. Congress is not where the action is. The Republicans control it. And I say, really? Isn't it funny when I go up there, I bump into all kinds of coal, oil, gas lobbyists, nuclear power lobby. They must know where the action is. Well, the response from Soros, Steyer, and Gore was basically, Congress, that's not where the action is. It's back home. Well, it takes two hands to clap. You can clap back home and try to use less air conditioning in your business or home. But if you're going to change the way our Constitution is structured, Congress, Congress, Congress. To this day, that message has not been driven home. So the organization and mobilization back in the districts are not focusing on Congress. There should be Congress watchdog groups, singularly developed and focused on this issue, where they summon the two senators, representatives to various locales in their district and their state. It's not that hard to do. For most states, 500 to 600 clearly written petitioners with their occupation and address will get a senator to your town hall meeting, where you can eyeball them without any flax, without any email intermissions, eyeball to eyeball, and send them back to Washington. Not done. So you have a catastrophe facing the world, and you have the most amateurish civic movement imaginable. You have these spurts at the UN and spurts at the kids marching in 22 countries and so forth. Greta had it right. She started in front of the parliament in Sweden. She was like 12 years old. She knew more where the decision had to be made than a lot of people 4 times her age and experience. So that's what has to be done. Senator by senator, representative by representative. You already have probably 200 on your side from the get-go. You have people in charge who are adamantly opposed, like Moscow Mitch McConnell and others. However, these people, once the people back home mobilize, and they know they're not going to go away, they know they're informed, they're going to be summoned back. They have a lot of recess in Congress time to go back to the town meetings, and it's not their town meeting. It's not their choreographed rigged town meeting. It's a mobilization in one community after another, and they have to face it again and again until they go back and do the right thing. All right, so what is the right thing? Well, here's where there's a lot of good proposals, a lot of good agendas. Timetables often aren't as specific as they should be. But basically, we're dealing with displacement economics. The bulk of the fossil fuel and nuclear industry have to be replaced by a completely different structure, and it needs a different infrastructure to get the wind power across and here and there and store solar and all that. But it can be done, the displacement can be done on schedule. Now, to displace a powerful industry, you not only need to overcome them in Congress, you need to persuade the public that the convenience of the fossil fuel industry is a portent of disaster for their children, if not for themselves, in terms of climate catastrophe. And speaking of language, why are the people still using climate change instead of climate crisis, climate catastrophe, climate disaster? And here's why. The phrase climate change was created by a Republican Party word artist. His name is Frank Lutz, L-U-T-Z, about 2002, because the Republicans came to him and said, you know, this phrase global warming is too scary. He said, well, just use climate change. And what happened? The Democrats lapped it up like a cat lapping milk. Well, you don't convey the seriousness of a problem by talking about climate change. When I grew up, the climate change was the 4 seasons: summer, autumn, winter, spring. So we need to have much more forceful words and phrases to get the process across, which means we need like 3 sentences where you run right through droughts, fire, sea level rises, floods, habitat change leading to broader ranges for malaria, etc. You see? Mass migrations, fleeing, civil strife, international strife. You got to do it in 2 sentences. And what do? They keep talking about climate change. These are the environmentalists. So I talked to Bill McKibben. I said, Bill, you know, you got to have stronger language. And he said, yeah, you're probably right. He said, but I like global warming still as one of the best phrases. But very few others responded. Now there's an engineer and a lawyer. His name is David Freeman. Now, most people have never heard of him. You have, Jim, because you've talked to him on the phone. Well, yeah. He ran TVA, and he's run several giant utilities and advised Jimmy Carter way back. He's run giant businesses. And he has a plan to reduce fossil fuel usage X number percent every year until it's eliminated. He says, we have to pass legislation that decrees the end of fossil fuel, not regulate, decrees the end of fossil fuel by a deadline and a schedule. So if you have any undergraduates there, Jim,
yeah, let
me just tell you, you're entitled to look at our generation's civil action strategy as amateurish. Amateurish, bereft of self-introspection, mindlessly repetitive, and doomed to fail. That's your challenge for your generation. We don't expect you to follow, we expect you to lead.
Terrific.
End.
Excellent. Outstanding. I want to open it up to questions for Ralph. Students, first of all. Mitchell, you're muted.
Yeah, I guess my first question would be.
Mitchell's from Wisconsin. He's just was observing the primary there.
Yeah, my first question would be basically what concrete steps do you take? Like why are environmental groups not having a presence, a lobby? Like what concrete steps do we do to change their mind and convince them that Congress is the place that you need to send somebody?
Well, one, the national environmental groups have no grassroots to speak of other than Lois Gibbs's group. The national NRDC, ED, they're national operations, they're litigation powerhouses, and of course, litigation is not the best instrument anymore. It's very delayed, and you have right-wing corporate judges and so on. They raise their money through large grants or memberships. And so their memberships are just check writing people around the country, like 500,000 people contribute, average of what, $50, $100 to NRDC a year. They're not activists. Now, Lois Gibbs wanted to say to the big ones, and she has chapters all over the country working on local toxic contamination of water and things like that. And they have a lot of victories locally because the mothers are concerned with their children who are coming down with illnesses. It's very concrete, very motivating. She said, look, let me build this grassroots. They're not interested. So the national environmental groups, a few exceptions, Greenpeace once in a while, they don't have much power back in the districts. You have 425 districts. You have 50 states in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands, etc. And that invites people like Steyer and Gore. Gore is very rich now. He got in early in Google and all that, sold his cable for $500 million. And of course, Soros is worth over $40 billion. So the idea is to spend $20 million a year, this is de minimis, on 100 people who are engineers, lawyers, PR people, writers, who go up on Capitol Hill every day. They know every corridor, every staff, every member, every week. Why did Senator Scott change his mind when he was a climate denier in Florida? All right. Well, how come Senator Jim Inhofe is not changing his mind? They're both cut from the same Republican clenched jaw modality. So you know everything. You know about what procurement the federal government can direct to replace fossil fuel with solar energy or energy efficiency. The government is the biggest customer. You know all that. Then back home, you spend $100 million. These are these multi-billionaires who say we're heading for doom. You don't have to convince them. Spend at least $100 million and you start Congress watchdog groups in every congressional district who have formal summons to have personal interactions with senators and representatives at town meetings. The Congress watchdog groups would be composed of 2 offices and 4 full-time people in every congressional district. And the membership is between 3 is basically 1/2 of 1%. We're talking 125. We're talking about 2,000 people per district that become the members of the Congress watchdog, and they commit 300 to 500 hours a year and $300 to $500 a year to support these offices once the $100 million is spent. Now, that's what a hobby is in the United States. The average hobby, stamp collecting, coin collecting, so on, they spend $300 to $500 a year and 300 to 500 hours. So you have a Congress watchdog lobby, but it has to be kick-started by a $100 million investment, which is nothing for these people. I mean, they lose that on a couple of options, in Wall Street. That's the tragedy. Never has there been so much enlightened billionaires, and never have they not known what to do at all. Steyer spent tens of millions of dollars on ads on global warming and impeaching Trump. And he didn't even move the needle. So they may know how to make a lot of money better than any of us, but they don't have any idea on what to do with it, even though they think they do, because they know how to make a lot of money. So specifically Congress watchdog groups, 2 offices, 2 people in every office, in every district, around a major agenda that's hurled against Congress with a deadline. Now, you may wonder why I'm not talking about elections. Well, elections are important, but the election will come out better as a byproduct of lobbying these members as incumbents. So they either lose the next election or they change their mind. In the 1960s, we went to Senator Magnuson and others who were known to be yes people for big business. In 4 years, Magnuson became the greatest consumer protection legislator in American history. Auto safety, product safety, you name it. He got it through the Senate, and his prestige got it through the House, and Nixon signed them. Nixon and Lyndon Johnson signed them into law. When the Congress is turned around, the White House is forced to turn around. Some will say, what do you mean? Well, Congress is by far the most powerful branch of government, even though it gives its power to declare war, to spend, and so on to the executive branch unconstitutionally, because they're lazy. They don't want the responsibility. Most people don't know Congress only works 2.5 days a week. They come in on Tuesday morning, they leave Thursday afternoon. They have weeks of recess, August, May, February. They work about 120 days a year rather. And that's why there's so little oversight hearings. How do you have hearings Monday and Friday when they're gone? I can schedule my meetings with these members by their flight back home. They're going back to Boston, they're going back to Chicago. So they become very lazy, and because they have redistricted by gerrymandering, most of them have safe seats. They're only vulnerable in primaries, not in the general election. And as a result, you get the conformity and the concentration of power in the hands of McConnell and Pelosi at the top, which never was the case. As committee chairs, as Jim knows, were much more powerful years ago.
Well,
It is, and I've written this in a little paperback. It's called "Breaking Through Power." It's easier than we think. Even has the summons, the formal summons of the senators, representatives to the People's Town Meeting. Breaking through power, it's easier than we think.
Ralph, let me ask Gail Bradbrook, who's chairman of Extinction Resistance, to just comment here on your approach from the standpoint of where she sits in the UK and also in the global green movement on the ground.
Thanks, Jim. Hi, Ralph. I mean, as a UK person, the political system in the US is not something that I over in great detail, but I suppose certainly our approach has been to focus on political demands to governments. We have 3 demands: net zero by 2025, tell the truth, and a citizens' assembly to decide how to take things forwards. It's been done slightly differently in the US, but I guess I was just sort of wondering, as I was listening to you talking about environmental NGOs, and Extinction Rebellion was founded on the fact that we didn't think the movement was doing what was necessary, and that's no disrespect for the people's efforts, but we felt something different needed to happen. I guess looking from over the water, the Sunrise Movement has looked to have a degree of success in the States, and I just wondered what you thought about that as a movement in terms of its impact politically.
I had a hard time hearing Jim.
What did you think of
the first part? The parliamentary systems obviously are different. Sometimes they're a lot easier than the U.S. because once you win a majority, you don't have to worry about filibusters and all the rest of the obstructions in our system. But what was her final point?
The question about the Sunrise Movement in the United States. What do you make of their approach here, and is that focused enough?
Well, they're all very good. They're very well intentioned. They show great emotional intelligence. They have, I think, their program, the Green New Deal, is too vague. It was deliberately vague because of political strategy. but it's been filled out. You know, people like Professor Robert Poland, University of Massachusetts, he has a great detail on how it can create more jobs, more stable jobs, better jobs than the present system. So it can be argued not just in environmental health and global survival, it can be argued in terms of a higher quality of an economy and a lower unemployment rate and a greater local reliance. So you get your energy renewably locally. You don't have to rely on huge prolonged supply chains and pipelines and oil tankers and all the risks that are involved. But they just don't take it far enough. They don't take it. It's like, you know, Occupy Wall Street. I tried to get them, you know, they had the eye of the media for 10 weeks, which is very rare, you know, eye of the mass media. And I said, okay, why don't you do minimum wage? 30 million people in the U.S. making less than 1968, adjusted for inflation. And they all said on this big conference call, we agree fully, but you know what? We don't know how to organize anything. So it's that lack of conclusion, lack of focus, lack of asking the question, okay, we're the people and we're sovereign, but who makes the decision? Who makes the decision with the compulsion of law? Well, it's not us, it's the Congress, it's the state legislature. And they don't go to that level. They should know everything about every member of Congress. That's what the corporate lobbyists do. They even know what their golf handicap is. They know what their favorite dessert is. Personal is political. But we outnumber them vastly. 1,500 corporations getting their way with the majority of Congress. There are millions of people out there. All it takes is 1% or less. Again, that book, Breaking Through Power, it's easier than we think, shows that in American history, great changes were made. Never more than 1% of the people committed seriously to civic engagement. Never. Even the civil rights movement didn't have more than 1%. We changed the auto industry. Regulating, we didn't have 1,000 people out there around the country. No more than 1,000 people. The whole tobacco industry was challenged and brought to bear. And dramatic reduction in smoking, and finally regulation by the FDA through Congress. I asked Mike Perchuk, who is a key staffer in the Senate and the leader in the fight against tobacco. Mike, at the peak in the 1980s, how many full-time people in the United States you think are pulling this off? You know, doctors, civic advocates, writers against the tobacco industry, which is considered all-powerful. He said no more than 1,000. Wow. I said, how could this be? He says, because they have public opinion behind them. The ingredients are, you represent public opinion, or you can change it to be majority public opinion. Do you know what you're talking about? You know how to answer the first, second, third, fourth question when you're challenging someone on the science and et cetera, and economics of global warming. And the third is, you have a handful of full-time people who are in the vanguard, focusing like a laser beam on members of Congress or state legislature. That's what you need. That's the lesson of history.
Right. Kieran Chokshi has a question for you. He's a student. You're muted. You're muted, Kieran.
Hey, Mr. Nader. Thanks for coming to speak with us. I'm one of the undergrads here. I was really thinking a lot about how you mentioned climate disaster, catastrophe, and price as better terms than change for helping people get that this fossil fuel industry creates big social inefficiencies. But I think in the US, people and individuals are going to be the least harmed by climate change individually. We're the most wealthy country with lots of resources and low population density. What are other strategic ways to make popular arguments about inefficiencies, social inefficiencies in the US, you think?
Well, if I understood you on the line, just to put it simply, you know, Miami Beach, they have a relocation plan, not for people, for Miami Beach. So this is something. I mean, it's not going to be like Bangladesh because of its lower sea level and so on. It's going to affect people enormously. The idea, we see these mass tornadoes. Look at the last one. It hit 175 miles an hour. Mass flooding, Mississippi, 1,000-year floods, massive wildfires, rising sea levels, corrosive drought, right? And every time they're in the news, right? You turn on the national news and they have these great satellite pictures and photography, and someone says to their children, that is climate change. Are you kidding? That's climate destruction, catastrophe.
Yeah.
So the inefficiency is exemplified by real life devastation. Real life devastation. And I don't know if I understood your, Jim.
I think that's right. I mean, how do you dramatize this to American audience?
It's dramatized by nature. Nature's communicating. I used to say, nature takes a lot of insults, but there comes a line that when you go beyond that line, it turns on its tormentors with a savagery that can never be paralleled by the savagery of mankind. So the power of nature is communicating to us all the time. And even the deniers now used to say, well, it's just a natural cycle. We've had a huge hurricane, 1938, and we had a big flood and whatever. No, now you can see the public opinion polls, including more and more deniers. And I mean, you're a denier in Alabama, you're a denier in Oklahoma, you know, with the droughts, you're a denier in California with the fires, you know. So nature is our main communicator now, but we're not giving nature the right language. We're not calling it the right language. You have to be very worried about this because the Republicans work overtime to get the right language implanted in people's brains. And our side has been often immediately acceptance. For example, they call these avaricious sellers in the healthcare industry providers. They call corporate arenas the private sector. They call the estate tax the death tax. You know, they've changed the language. As Confucius said, if you can control the way something's described, you're on your way to prevailing. And as far as I know, he didn't use email and had no internet connection for such wisdom.
Ralph, this is a terrific message. I think that I wanted to ask Gabriel Cruz, who's in South Africa right now and trying to organize in that environment, what he makes of your message about focusing on lobbying efforts.
Hi, Jim. Yeah, thank you very much. I think that I suppose it's got to be right. My sense is very much that the head kind of does lead the rest of the political body, and so the thought that very small, organized, coordinated people can make great change seems appropriate to me. The great moments in history, some of them that I look at, that have like the abolition of slavery, in South Africa, the abolition of apartheid, have required exactly that kind of work. So that seems correct to me. I suppose I do wonder in South Africa what chance our Greens stand of prevailing given the kinds of crises we have. But maybe that's off topic for now. It's just if you've got a lot of problems on your plate as a country, then I think that holding that more long-term threat, because as much as the immediate environmental catastrophes, tornadoes, and hurricanes happen, the major damage of climate catastrophe is not yet upon us. Even if we've sown the seeds for it. That long-term horizon thinking is a hard thing, I think, to squeeze into a 24-meter environment, and in a world that's plagued by pandemic and all kinds of other problems.
By the way, I think your reference to the strategy by the abolitionists of slavery is very well put. We should study that. It was over 200 years ago. The Amazon is burning. The Amazon is burning. We have a Trump in charge of Brazil, Bolsonaro. He's basically said, go for it to the ranchers and the developers and so on. Burn as much as you want. And it's not a global crisis. It's not viewed that way. I mean, there are a few groups, Amazon Watch and groups in Europe and elsewhere, that are trying to focus attention. This is one of the greatest catastrophes underway. I mean, you're burning an area of Wisconsin and half of Minnesota every year. And you know what the effect of the Amazon is to the global ecology. Here's my comment. Groups like who are against corporate managed globalization, and we're paying the price now with the virus, and not one company in the US produces antibiotics. It's all outsourced to China. The bulk of our medicines and active materials in medicines have been outsourced by profiteering US drug companies, subsidized to the hilt, tax credits, free research and development from the National Institutes of Health. That wasn't enough. They exported it and they left us with a tremendous national security peril now. And so all these people, they get satisfied with the most modest resurgence. Like for years, the people who are against globalization, corporate style, not civic globalization. That's very important, civic. They kept referring to Seattle. You remember, the big rallies in Seattle, 1999. And so you get a big demonstration, or you get a day where people march all over the world at the same time, and then they turn it into nostalgia. Like, oh, isn't this great? Look what we did. But until you ask the question, did you change any members of the Congress vote? Did you get any congressional hearings? Did you get any legislation? A majority of members of Congress afraid of opposing your position on penalty of losing the election? They don't go all the way. If you don't go all the way, it's just like someone climbing a hill and they stop halfway and they start bragging that who cares about the rest of it? They've gone up halfway. And I once entertained the thought 2 years ago that young people were going to march in the tens and hundreds of millions around the world regularly, protesting, like Greta started. And that seems to be tapering off a bit. But we need to constantly ask the following question. What's the final decisional result form? What's the form has to make the final decision? And that's what all the effort, all the rallies, marches, powerful speeches, they go up into the ether. Too many of them are on weekends when legislatures are not even in session. They go up into the ether and come back home and said, well, we did our part. What are all you people doing? Watching sports? No, get off our back. We've done our part. There isn't that throughput. That's why you got to grab some of these enlightened billionaires who have talked and talked again about the perils of climate catastrophe and say, we need money to hire organizers, to hire advocates, to hire people who can speak to 1,000 people a week. You get 1,000 people who know how to spread this word. If they speak to 1,000 people a week in small groups, right? Just think what that means. 1,000 people speaking to 1,000 people a week is 1 million people.
Great
So
message, Ralph.
why can't Soros hire that? We used to have these lecturers in the populist progressive movement, the Farmers' Rebellion in the 1890s, and starting from Texas and going to Oklahoma and going west and south. They did it with what they call lecturers. They went from farm to farm. And I'm talking person to person, not virtual reality.
We had the Nader Raiders back when, how I met you in 1968.
Yeah, see how important that phrase was, Jim. That was coined by the Washington Post. That phrase was worth millions of man hours because it immediately grabbed people's attention when it was discussed on TV, like the Phil Donahue show and so on. So it's the importance of nomenclature. It's extremely important. A lot of times when people make 100 speeches on the subject, one person, and they get applause, and they really think they're getting through. They don't change the words. They're not introspective enough. You got to have fresh language. That's what happened to Bernie Sanders. He didn't have fresh language. Fresh language encapsulates a broader range of thought, policy, aspiration, strategy, tactics, hits people in different nerve points. You just use the same old words.
Gabriel,
So you got to grab these billionaires.
I'm going to give Gabriel
these big Yale graduates that built huge businesses.
Okay, here comes a slightly tougher question. What do you say to people who worry about big green corporations looking to get subsidized business with kickbacks that aren't going to be as competitive as they would be if it wasn't sort of mandated through legislation? In other words, what do you say to people who say, you know, I like the idea of the world going green. I really don't like the idea of us suffering climate calamity, but I worry about corporate capture of state resources in an inefficient way in order to do that.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, the whole theory of incentives, otherwise known as subsidies, handouts, bailouts, tax breaks, very, very inefficient and sometimes worse because it replaces far better strategies and gives people a sense of complacency, especially lawmakers who love to give away the taxpayers' money. And so I believe, along with, I'm sure, Jim and Dave Freeman and others, in mandatory requirements. Lead was taken from gasoline and paint. Mandatory requirement. They didn't say, you know, we're going to attenuate it and reduce it. It was finally, when they got around to it, out. No lead got gone. Vinyl chloride gone. So we have to work on mandates like that. The rule of law and order. You know, this is clear and present danger. Law and order. The second thing is that you can stimulate competition with government procurement, federal, state, local government procurement. Hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. They buy almost everything we buy, except for nuclear weapons, things like that. They buy cars, they buy paper, they buy food, they buy transportation, they buy clothing, they buy household chemicals, whatever. And the procurement, and we've had conferences on this, and John Richard can give them a lot of information on that, Jim. Yeah. The procurement power can basically say, look, you want our business? You want the government's business? We don't want to buy from anybody who doesn't have a fast track towards solar, renewable, and energy efficiency, toward preservation of water, toward protection of land cover, soil, etc. It's a huge tool. Yeah. And the companies are desperate for government business. So they will compete. That's a better way of competing. We have to attack the whole concept of market fundamentalism. Market fundamentalism is the greatest fraud ideologically in history. Greatest fraud. There's no such thing as a free market except for a teenage lemonade stand on a farm road. And we had a conference on that too.
Yeah,
in Washington. This has been really,
Ralph, this has been really stimulating. I have to move on to Gail and John here, but I wanted to thank you so much, and just terrific. I wish we had known that you were available for more time, but let me.
No, that's fine. I've had my piece, and you got to hear from some very, very good people in England, South Africa, and elsewhere. And as Yale law students, you ought to be happy you're getting this kind of exposure, even though you're not in class because of the virus. But believe me, your generation doesn't read enough, doesn't think enough, doesn't personally converse enough with each other, and is deprived of imagination short of the apps. So you ought to start really worrying about yourself as a young generation. Spend more time in reality, less time in virtual reality, more time face to face, except for the virus, and less time text messaging. End of sermon.
End of sermon. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay.
So Gail, over to you. I want to introduce Gail Bradbrook, who has been spearheading the Extinction Resistance. She has a long background in the tax justice movement with Tax Justice Network. But let me have you introduce yourself a little bit, and then maybe you and John could talk a little bit about, you know, your approach to this topic.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I guess the first thing to say, really on that question of the money and the billionaires, Extinction Rebellion was named the #1 influencer on climate in the globe after 18 months in existence, and an awful lot of effort and an awful lot of personal risk for many people. I can say more about our techniques. It included mass mobilization techniques, declares, grief, truth-telling, and we're out of money, actually. It's quite astonishing. Like, where are the billionaires, actually? So just to put that out there, we need some money, folks. We've done a really good job so far, so cough up and help us. And then I think the thing that I really want to say, I guess, to start off with is about subsidies, incentives. It's $10 million. Is it a minute, John Christensen? A minute for the fossil fuel
$10 million.
I think you're on mute, my love. John, you're on mute.
No, no, it's $10 million.
He's still on mute. or you're not, or your volume's not high enough, John.
Your volume's not high enough, John.
Well, let's have a quick look at that. Is that any better now?
That's better. I can hear you.
Okay,
Gail?
so look, you're right. It's $10 million of every minute of every day of every year.
Can other people hear? I can't hear that, to be honest.
Yep.
Okay, I'll let it go then.
10 million per day, per minute, per year, for every day of every year.
Yeah, I think that's IMF figures, John probably said. So it's an incredible capture. And then this topic was billed as being about the climate crisis. In Extinction Rebellion, we're talking about extinction. We're in the 6th mass extinction event. We're talking about an ecological crisis. And COVID-19 is from that crisis. It's a part of the ecological crisis. We knew this kind of thing was coming. It's been talked about. Bill Gates talked about it. Reminds me too much, for example. I've got somebody else needs to mute, actually.
Yeah, Barry, could you mute? Barry, could you mute?
How do you do that?
So the COVID crisis is a result of animal agriculture and biodiversity loss. That's the kind of thing that creates viruses. That also creates the climate crisis as well. This isn't, unfortunately, just about fossil fuels. We have a water crisis. We have a soil crisis. We have an oceanification crisis. And we need to use, whoever's hosting this could mute Barry's iPhone themselves if they know how to do this. You just go on and mute him.
Thomas, are you there? Could you mute Barry's phone?
I could if I were the host. I'm not.
Barry's done it. Thanks, Barry. We were tuning into your family. So what I want to say is we have an ecological crisis. We need 1.7 planets for the levels of consumerism that we do. And so when we just purely make this about the fossil fuel industry, which of course it's massively about the fossil fuel industry, we're missing a point. This is a systemic crisis. And I'm not in disagreement with Ralph about needing to use the right language and so on. It's more tricky to talk about a systemic crisis, but that's the reality, is that we have a fundamental flaw in democracy caused by the deep the deep flaws in the system created by corruption. I mean, our system is so unbelievably corrupt, as I know that many people know here. And what I'm talking about is when half of world trade is running through tax havens, when you can buy law through a number of mechanisms going offshore in secrecy jurisdictions and so on. That's not democracy. And so, as you know, I'm sitting here with spent all my savings on Extinction Rebellion, had to put my house into a trust actually to try and protect myself a little bit. I could be in jail by the end of the year. No billionaire money coming this way. You know, that's the reality of like why I haven't got 50 lobbyists in Parliament, although Parliament did pass did pass a bill similar to what XR wanted, not exactly the same. So we have this systemic crisis. The systemic crisis is about our economic system that insists on GDP growth, planetary destruction. You have to measure the economy in a different way. You can have a growth in human progression. So you've got economists like Tim Jackson talking about prosperity without growth. We have to have those massive questions. Now, what's interesting with the COVID crisis is, you know, capitalism is suddenly asking for socialism to bail it out. And I'm not here to advocate for one ideology over another. What we keep saying in Extinction Rebellion is we need a grown-up conversation about the systemic issues that we've got in our democracy and in our economic system and how that all interlocks. And frankly, it's a psychotic system run by people who've got skin in the game and believe that they'll be okay. I don't know if people saw Douglas Rushkoff's blog. It's an incredible blog. He got paid he's a professor, I think, in upstate New York, professor of digital. He got given half his annual salary to go and speak to 5 hedge fund managers, and they wanted to know where to build their bunkers. And one of them already had. And should they put electric collars on their guards to keep them disciplined when the event happened, when society melts down? This is what we're talking about. So, I mean, I think the thing I wanted to finish on saying is, you know, Extinction Rebellion has, and I agree with Ralph, you have to keep changing your tactics. Just doing the same thing over and over again. Occupy is one big problem. One of it was it just had one tactic, Occupy. Get rid of the occupation, it's done with. I think the school strikes really need to think about what other tactics they have up their sleeve. And what we're seriously talking about now is a money strike. You know, we can do this online. It's called a distributed form of civil disobedience, and it would be done like this. It's called a conditional commitment. I'll do it if you'll do it. And so it would be no bailouts for business as usual. Business as usual cannot be allowed to carry on. And we need bailouts for people and planet. And obviously therein lies some detail I won't get into right now unless people ask me questions. How do you do not have power without civil disobedience? I don't believe that it all just comes from lobbying politicians. There's too much capture of the democratic system. There's too much money behind the scenes. So you have power through civil disobedience, and our strongest power lies in our willing to participate in the system. And the willing comes from paying off debts, paying off mortgages, paying taxes and so on. If we collectively say we're not going to do that, some version of that, then we have the power back. And how we were going to go about that, we can just ask people if they're interested in doing some kind of money strike, and then we can ask them for details about what they're willing to do. That's a mass mobilization technique. So that's what we're focused on next. One of the demands is likely to be for a global citizens' assembly. I think we have to rewire the operating system of humanity, and that cannot be left to major bodies being lobbied left, right and centre by these massive organisations. It needs people. You have to trust the people and give people some more agency. Thank you.
Open for questions for people. Let me start with one. The Citizens Assembly, can you say something more about that? That's, I think you're farther along with Citizens Assemblies.
Yeah, the one that's running in France is actually legally binding, which is what they need to be to give them true legitimacy. Basically, they are a panel that demographically represent the people of that country. If you did it globally, it would demographically represent the globe. People are chosen at random by a process called sortition. And they are given critical thinking skills and use very strong facilitation techniques like convergent facilitation. that has got a better chance of bringing about agreement. So it's not about putting people into this like ongoing debate, my side, your side. It's about sharing information and then asking people to think together and to come up with a sort of convergent process. They're very powerful. They've been used in a number of cases already across the world on a number of issues successfully. And it will tackle issues like the Gilets jaunes that came back and said you cannot, impose taxes. We're already struggling too much. And so Extinction Rebellion hasn't come up with a whole pile of policy measures because, frankly, should everybody be vegan or stop flying? Or should we have carbon rationing or budgeting or a carbon dividend or this form of taxation? I mean, there's lots of debates out there. So it's important to give people a say in that. And I think it's important for social movements not to think they know everything and to make space for democratic change.
Great. Mitchell, you have a...
I guess a question that I have is with something like a money strike or these very huge collective sort of civil disobedience movements, how do you convince people who are benefiting from the system right now, who feel like this system works for them for the moment? How do you convince those people, the middle class worker who brings home their money, pays their mortgage, how do you convince them that something like what you're proposing helps them?
You're mute, Gail.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I didn't hear what Mitchell said. I just typed in the chat.
So how do you convince ordinary people that this is in their interest? What is your, Ralph get a few arguments about that. What would you suggest?
I mean, there's been some sophisticated discussions about how to message to different audiences. So you've got George Marshall, who's an expert in that in the UK. It's important to use different language with different groups. There just isn't one thing that works for everybody. I think a really strong part of Extinction Rebellion has been looking at intergenerational injustice. Frankly, just putting it like this, I think we have way too much of a kind of unconscious racism in environmentalism that kind of goes, it's a problem that's going to affect somebody else somewhere else at some other time, and hopefully not my kids. And that's not that you're like this mean person who wishes bad things to happen to people in Africa, but that's a sort of unconscious thought process. And trying to meet people on the basis, purely on the basis of justice messaging is only going to work for some people. It's not going to work for everybody. And when you make it clear that it's a legacy that you're leaving to your grandchildren and to your children, thanks Mitchell for the clarification, I'll come to that. When it's something that you're leaving to your children, grandchildren, it makes it a lot more visceral. And one of the big differences has been welcoming people to actually have emotion about this and not just intellectual reasoning, because so many people are already really stretched. Right, how do you convince ordinary people to join a money strike? Well, here's the thing. First of all, lots of people cannot afford to pay going forwards. That there's a kind of like won't pay and can't pay issue here. So there's a coming together of different issues. And then I don't know if you're aware of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan's research about social movements, which says that for significant change, you need about 3.4% of the population to rise up and work together. I mean, there are problems in that data, but that's looking at 330 odd different changes to dictatorships and things like that. What that's really telling us, it doesn't need everybody, that you need a sort of certain amount of people. It's not that you need to convince everybody about this thing. But certainly, like in the UK, we have a history of around poll tax rebellions, one going many years ago, and a more recent one in Mrs. Thatcher's time that actually took down Mrs. Thatcher in the early 90s. These things have a snowball effect. You actually have to build them through waves. And the basic mass mobilization techniques that actually have been mostly developed in the US. You need some leading edge people that do it because they're just like, I've had enough. And I tell you what, there are some awesome postmenopausal women that are in that bracket, right? Who are like, you know, we've had 93-year-old grandmothers carried off Waterloo Bridge in London. We're not doing this anymore. And they do it from what you would call virtue ethics, which mean we care so much about this. You cannot touch us because we know we're right and we will just do whatever it takes. And it's that kind of person that won't wait to do something. Like, they'll do it because they believe in it. And you find those kind of early adopters, if you like, and you know, like it's like a bell curve, isn't it? And then there are other people that would go, I'll do this if other people join me. So if you've got a mortgage, let's say with Barclays Bank or whoever, who are awful funders of fossil fuel, then you know, do you want to be the lone person taking on that, or would you do it if 1,000 other Barclays Bank mortgage holders do it with you, and you've got some collective power and you're talking to each other? So that's why what we need to do with the mass mobilization technique is get people's interest and then find out more details about them. There's already a rent strike that's taking place right now in London, and there's something called genstrike.org, I think, that's based in the US, encouraging other forms of rent and debt striking. I think the other interesting thing is this is, you know, as I said, this is about rewiring humanity. This is about upcycling what we have and doing something better. You've got some phenomenal economic suggestions out there, like Kate Raworth with donut economics, and I mentioned Tim Jackson. There's a lot of good ideas out there. It's not like trying to bring anything down. The point that I most strongly want to make is this system is bringing itself down. As a Paul Mason economist in the UK said, it's not like the financial crisis when the roof fell in. This is the foundations being pulled out, and this is because this system is based on a kind of I can't use a different word other than patriarchal idea that you're just all powerful over nature and somehow you're immune, you know, somehow you're better than and above everything. It's just like really not the reality. Nature's in charge, actually, and we're getting a big lesson in that, and that people think they're going to be shielded. So it's going to bring itself down, and we have to say, like, you can't, you know, you cannot. And in the UK, we're probably going to have the worst COVID. Well, I think here's an interesting point, right? I think the COVID deaths are probably going to be bigger in the countries most captured to neoliberal free market fundamentalism. I imagine there'll be a correlation, actually, but let's see. Because I think it involves that sort of ridiculous mentality. We know in the UK that Boris Johnson was pulling the chief medical officer's advice in press releases at the last minute. He was just unable to make sensible decisions. So anyway, this system's going to bring itself down, and I think that's why a lot of people won't have a choice but to not pay. There's only so much bailing out that can happen. We have to shift into, I mean, you know, people have different ideas, but one of the ideas is private restraint and public luxury. So that means things like universal basic services, and then people working in the economy on work that has meaning, you know. So that's why you have to have indicators for the economy that actually make sense, like, you know, that you've got things like the genuine progress indicator, or you've got, you know, got other things that measure prosperity before growth, that kind of thing. It's not about, you know, one thing's like throw about environmentalists who want us all back in the caves. It's absolute nonsense. You know, the growth and human progress aren't coupled. They are in the early stages of development, but not after a while. But what is coupled is increased debt and increased problems in the world. It's clear we're on the hockey stick curve. So,
thank you, Gail. Let me ask John Christensen just to complement that. John has led the global tax justice movement for some time, and I think we're now beginning to see ways in which climate justice and tax justice sort of go hand in hand. So maybe he could say a little bit about that. And also, just from your experience in organizing, you heard Ralph and Gail, what works? You know, do we get silos here, or do people who care about green issues come over and care about inequality? Or, you know, rent strikers want to support climate justice? Is there cross-pollination there? Yeah. John.
Jim, can you all hear me, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay. So Jim, first of all, is there cross-pollination definitely. And I think that the current crisis is helping to deepen that sense of intersectionality of issues, because people recognize that we have not one crisis on our hands with COVID-19, we have multiple crises. I think our job is to communicate not just that there are these crises, but there are solutions as well. Let me first talk a little bit about the issues where tax justice and climate crisis intersect. And let me take you back to the early 1990s. I was part of a working group of the UK Treasury looking at carbon taxation. And we recognized then that carbon taxation was a way of supercharging or turbocharging the transition away from fossil fuels. Because the so-called market in energy has been so rigged for such a long time. And Ralph is absolutely right when he talks about the nonsense of market fundamentalism. The subsidies paid into the fossil fuels sector, the IMF put it at about $10 million per second, every minute of every day of every year. 5.2 trillion. That includes the disastrous environmental impacts, but it doesn't include the really long-term geopolitical issues, including the wars that we fought out over fossil fuels over the last century. So you can increase that 5.2 trillion cost. But we recognized back in '92 that if you were going to introduce carbon taxes, you had to compensate lower income households. Otherwise, working people, ordinary low income households would be very much worse off. And there had to be a redistributive thing. So right from the start, there was this ideological barrier, because the politicians who were fighting the case to protect the fossil fuel industry were able to say there was no way we're going to get involved in redistributing things. This is the heart of neoliberalism. The heart of neoliberalism is precisely to ensure that there's no redistribution of wealth and income. So tax justice sits there right at the heart, and the only way we can win the kind of communications battle here is by targeting poor, low-income households, low-wage people, to ensure that they not only come out no worse off, but actually come out better off from a transition away from fossil fuels, and better off in all sorts of different ways. Better jobs, better paid. I'm in favor of Jim Boyce from University of Massachusetts, his idea of ensuring that a large part of whatever is raised from any kind of carbon tax is paid out as a carbon dividend in ways that ensure that lower income households come out significantly better. And of course, President Macron's changes, the proposals he put forward in the autumn of 2018 were the exact opposite. He provided a masterclass in how not to implement the necessary changes. So what he did simultaneously was he hiked fuel prices and he cut wealth tax. The richer people were very much better off, and the poorest people were very much worse off, particularly since public transport systems in France have been collapsing for the last 5 years. And that's precisely what not to do. So, I'm very much, to build on that intersectionality, to take it even further, cutting the fossil fuel subsidies will only be the first step in terms of fiscal measures to redress the market failures. Ralph talked about the infrastructure of the fossil fuel industry, which has been in place now for the better part of 100 years. We don't yet have, across most continents, the necessary infrastructure, including the political infrastructure, to ensure that we make that successful energy transition to renewables. we don't have, for example, the ability to tap in gigantic wind farms to national grids across the world. We don't have the battery or the storage capacity for the solar powers. All of that needs to be put in place. It will require massive investment. But we're reaching the stage where that massive investment is possible, and investors are increasingly looking at making that kind of investment. What will persuade them is to remove the fossil fuel subsidies, because those fossil fuel subsidies are so immense that they can tip investors' decision-making in favor of fossil fuels, particularly when the price goes south, as it has in the last month and a half. So that's where it intersects. But I think above all, Jim, we really must take seriously this idea that if we're going to go ahead with the Green New Deal on the scale that's needed in the next decade, it has to be built on the premise that working people are going to come out better off. And that's going to require very significant measures to redistribute wealth and income and ensure that jobs are better paid, and that working people see this as being to their benefit.
Terrific. That's a great setup for our next presenter, who is going to speak from a standpoint of someone who works with a lot of private companies, and he and I work together for Japanese clients that are involved in the green industry. You know, there is a lot that I think, to the point that we need both a strong public sector investments here, but also that a lot of these investments are profitable now and can begin to be made if we can get the cartels that are controlling things like power generation out of the way. Anybody, let's ask any questions we have for John before I turn it over to Andres Carvalho. But I think it'll be interesting to hear a dialogue between Gail, John, and Andres about the appropriate role of the private sector, because I take it that he's not quite as necessarily ready to write off some market initiatives in this area. So, Mitchell, any questions for John? Thank you.
I do have a question. So I totally agree that the idea of a carbon tax seems, in every iteration I've seen, to disproportionately affect low income people, which I think is very problematic. I, however, have not seen any great proposals as to the nuts and bolts of how you undo that. I agree, like I wrote a review actually of Boyce's argument for a carbon dividend, but even in a system like that, do you have some sense of how do the nuts and bolts work so that instantly the person, you know, low income people are getting the money back or are not paying the tax? Because people don't have the money to wait for the end of the year for a tax refund or to wait for some sort of, you know, credit at the end of the year. They need it instantly. Like, you know, if there's going to be a tax on their gasoline, they instantly need to pay a lower price than someone who is, you know, doesn't qualify for that same dividend. Do you have any sense of a nuts and bolts system that does that, or is that sort of something we need to work on?
We certainly need to work on that. I can't speak for the US, but I was in France at the time of the rebellion of the Gilets jaunes. And I interviewed and made a program about the Gilets jaunes protest, because it was being presented as if the Gilets jaunes were fundamentally anti-environmentalism. And that was just such a disservice to them, and frankly, it was such a misrepresentation. I really strongly object to that. You know, the biggest concern actually was on the public transport side, and you know, if you can get the public transport right in advance, then you can hike the gasoline. Just don't do it the other way around. You know, I don't want to be too disrespectful of President Macron, but frankly, he didn't even address the public transport thing. And if he had, no one would trust him to deliver, because he hasn't got a good, you know, when you talk about nuts and bolts, delivering public transport. The French are very good, but Macron has pretty much cut most of the investment in the fantastic tramway systems and the fantastic public transport systems that you have in some French cities. And that was the biggest concern of all, talking to the activists on the roundabouts in Brittany and in Picardy and elsewhere. Nuts and bolts wise, I think, you know, if you can persuade people that their lives would be made, particularly travel to work, that was the big concern. If you can tackle that one effectively, then you're halfway there.
Gail, I think this relates to the question of the basic income subsidy, which has been tabled in Spain now. I understand that they're thinking actively about it as a way of getting income to poor people. And this is driven primarily by the pandemic and the need to get people not to keep going to work. But it could also be a way of compensating them for carbon taxes or for other taxes that we have that are progressive, that poor people don't want to. We want to continue them to, you know, to be able to afford to travel and work. Where does that stand in the UK? And is there growing support for, or any talk about it in this conservative government?
Yeah. I mean,
well, we already have something called universal credit, which is a system and process. It's a long way from perfect, I can tell you, but which is designed to get money to people depending on how much they need. And it was sort of seen in some ways by like Joseph Rowntree, I believe, as a potential precursor to a universal basic income. There's some critique of universal basic income. It's supported by both the left and the right in some places. And I think part of the reason is to keep people consuming. And consumerism is like part of the problem. Getting off fossil fuels we can still kill the planet by 1,000 cuts rather than just, you know, the carbon dioxide. So consuming's an issue. But I think to put something in place, it would be incredibly sensible. And I think, as Mitchell points out, people can't wait till the end of the year to you know, people can't make the end of the month at the minute in many cases, never mind the end of the year. So I think one of the things that we're considering in Extinction Rebellion is what's called the deep adaptation agenda. So much of the environmental movement is pitched in ideological ways. And I know we're about to talk to Andres about business, and it's seen as anti-business and anti-markets and so on. Like, markets and business are not the same thing as free market fundamentalism. I'm sure we're all in agreement here, but just at shorthand, when you talk to these things, people want to label as anti-capitalist and anti, you know, back in the cave, all that sort of stuff, without even a definition of what we mean by capitalism. So I think it's really important to be clear that this is not an ideological struggle between one faction and another. We have to get beyond that. I really believe that. But what I was going to say about deep adaptation is we have to understand that crises are here now. There's one or another. I mean, the Anglia Ruskin University, for example, said by 2040 we'd be facing things like multi-breadbasket failure, that's food shortages, and then the NASA Goddard Institute saying things are getting worse. So it's, you know, likely to be food shortages, the food price hikes sooner. So any number of, you know, Mervyn King said a financial crisis would come sooner because, you know, former governor of the Bank of England. Any one crisis or others, what have we got in place to deal with crises? Because we're not in the Holocene, the stable climate anymore, we're in the Anthropocene. We have to have an adaptation agenda that people can get behind. And it's a bit like the best analogy, it's not the best analogy in many ways, but the one that people can relate to is wartime economies. You know, it's just, it ceases to be ideological, and it's about getting a job done. And that's how you kind of have to speak to people, I think. So we need sensible proposals and to stop getting in our camps, basically. And it's always been resisted because it sounds like some, you know, they call us watermelons, don't they? Green on the outside and red on the inside, environmentalists. Something bigger than that has to be discussed.
Excellent points about the difference between markets and you know, competition. I think that's you can have a lot of competition in a publicly owned environment where there's strong regulation, fact, it depends upon it. But anyway, let me, John, any last thought there from you? And then we'll turn it over to Andres, because he's got a lot to talk about here from his wealth of experience.
Let's go straight to Andres, because I think we could have a very interesting discussion. I suspect there's a lot more overlap in our thinking than Jim you might have signaled. So let's hear from Andres.
Right. Let me introduce him. Andres, you're muted. There you are. Andres Carvallo is a great friend of mine, going back to working on projects for Bell Labs in the 1990s, in which we helped to kind of construct a new internet, which unfortunately the company killed. But there was, he's gone on to a very successful career. He was CTO of a company called AustinEnergy.com, which is one of the leaders in the utility market for smart grids and decentralized power generation. He's an expert on solar and electric vehicles and wind and how you, most important, network all this stuff together. So we have written a big PowerPoint, but I think right now it's more appropriate for us to skip the slides, Andres, and just go to because we'll send that around to everybody, but we're just going to go to the heart of the matter, which is this important transition that you describe, the so-called digitalization movement. And just the background that you have, perspective on how private sector can relate to solving this problem.
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I am probably a fish out of water, but I'll do my best. I come at this from an engineering background in energy, telecommunications, computers, and software. And in addition to running CMG, I have the fortune now being a professor of innovation at Texas State. And my big job really at the university, which is a 40,000 student university in the middle of Central Texas, is to build a research park with 100 acres, million square feet, 6,000 people on 9 living labs, transforming digitization and connected infrastructure. And it's a phenomenal project. It started last November, so I'll tell you more about it. But when I hear you all talk, I tend to be maybe a little think differently. And what I see is I'm always being very focused on products and life cycle products, and the market segmentation of them, and the pricing and the benefits of them, and then the sort of the trends and make things make markets happen. So there is all kinds of trends going on, technology trends, cloud, mobile, so on and so on and so on. But there are really 3 fundamental trends that are going on that are driving how we're going from Industrial Revolution 1, 2, 3 into 4.0. And decarbonization is a big trend, clearly. And we'll talk about that in a moment, because if we don't fix that, we won't be here to enjoy the rest of that. But decentralization is probably one of the biggest trends. We're going from, big things being built to little things. Obviously, that takes advantage of things like Metcalfe's law and Moore's law. And so if you think about the transformation from mainframes to minis to personal computers to your smartphone, by the way, I don't know how many of you have realized that the computing capacity of your smartphone in your pocket, an iPhone or a Samsung or any of those phones, using the Snapdragon from Qualcomm or any of those CPUs, has more computational capacity and more memory storage than the entire Apollo 13 project. Okay, it's in your hand for $700. Right? So we are, society is moving very fast. Our human knowledge on tapping what's going on is driving this decentralization trend. And then, because things have gotten cheaper and computers and I was a first project manager for Windows working for Bill Gates. Lucky me, got hired right out of college to go work at Microsoft. And so the digitization of our society, all the way to, you can pick any movie that we're going to realize, Tron or The Matrix or Terminator, or whichever of those genres that you want to, Star Trek, Big Me Up, Scotty. That's what this is all going. But it's digitalization, not digitization, which is the ones and the zeros and turning everything into ones and zeros. But it's really the digitalization. So the new business models, right? The new relationships, the new processes, the re-engineering of society, of how we do work, how we play, how we study, how everything, right? And so if you think about COVID-19 is really forcing us to accelerate digitization, right? Because we can't be next to each other, but we have to go back to work. Or many companies actually that don't work in a face-to-face retail, restaurant, hospitality world, they haven't stopped working. In fact, they're working even faster and harder. In some cases, we're really gone from, if you have been in the global world in any big company, I used to work for digital equipment, HP, and Philips Electronics. And when I had those jobs, I would wake up at 3 a.m. to talk to Hong Kong, and at 6 a.m, go to bed for a couple hours, and then wake up at 6 a.m. to talk to London, and so on. So I would never sleep, right? And so that's kind of what's happening. And maybe our millennials are being trained that way because they're all bingers and they don't sleep and they're gaming all night long. And so this is the new world that we're heading into, right? And it's kind of hard to tell what, how this is all coming together, but it is happening. You can see it, all around us. And so the challenge that I see when I worked at Austin Energy, I invested, I had the opportunity to be the CTO, work for the CEO, and help the company transform. And in that transformation, build the first smart grid in the world. But the biggest thing about that is I deployed $4 billion worth of technology to create value and, increase power quality, increase renewable on the portfolio of generation, provide all kinds of tools and for consumers to manage their thermostats and their pool pumps. And we did electrification of charging infrastructure. I'm talking from 2003 to 2010. Most people were not thinking about any of this in 2003. So we were, I was driving all this in 2003, and I became a poster child, speaking all over the world. And I wrote a book about it. And since then, I've published 37 books. But the point of all this is we never raise rates. We never increase our fees. We actually deliver more value for the same amount of money or less money every year, right? And so there is a new thinking that we need to. We live in, I have always thought that we tend to live in a world of scarcity. Everything is going to end. We need to conserve it, and we need to really start thinking about how we enable a world of abundance. So you'll probably all know that the energy that lands or that hits the earth from the sun on one day, if we could capture it all, would be enough energy for the rest of our lifetime, right? You probably all know that. And so the question is, how do we, get to this world of abundance, where energy would be free, water would be free, just about any major service would be free if energy was free and abundant everywhere. Because the real issue about, when you think about all the things that we're discussing, equal pay, the digital divide, and all these challenges with poverty and what have you, that those are, results of the old construct of scarcity, and only a few having knowledge and access to the answers of the future, right? So you would agree that, we live in a lot better world, and if you're poor today, that in the 1400s, or pick any age, right? Because you live longer, you can go to the dentist, so on and so on and so on. But the challenge for me as an engineer is how we accelerate this so that really everybody can have the lifestyle and the quality of life that we all deserve, in my opinion. So, but think about the challenges. We're adding 2 billion people to the planet. So just think about that. So the United States, the farming industry in the United States had revenues of $143 billion last year. And the US feeds roughly 25% of the globe. So if we add another 2 billion people to the planet, that means that the yield of production of the same farm fields that we already have would need to increase 40% to maintain the global share to feed those people. So how we do that? That means more water. We're running out of water. All kinds of other issues. You need fuels. You need all kinds of things, right? The tractors are diesel tractors. We need to get rid of those tractors because we need to shift to CO2. So there's all this construct is convoluted, right? And so just to say, well, we're going to snap our fingers and get rid of this and get rid of that, we need to really restate our questions and truly understand and peel the onion on the problems. So for example, one of my favorite things about the global scale is I did a keynote in India in 2018 at the India Smart Grid Week. And I was just highlighting the comparison between the US, India, and China in terms of where the countries are. And obviously there is a logical long-term battle for who will be the next superpower, 100 years from now or 10 years from now, or whenever timetable you want to pick. So think about this. There's a direct correlation between generation capacity, the ability to create electricity, and GDP growth to feed the people that live in your country. So in our country, we have roughly 340 million people, about 130 million workers. We have a generation capacity of 1.1 gigawatts, right? And so if you compare us to India, the population, 1.3 billion, roughly 487 million work. They have a generation capacity of only 335 gigawatts, a third of our capacity. Okay, and then you take China, who is really giving us a run for our money. They have 1.3 billion roughly as well, population, 776 million workers, and their generation capacity is 1.5 gigawatts. So, I'm sorry, 1,500 gigawatts. I'm just in my mind rounding things the wrong way. So 1.5 terawatts. So 1,100 gigawatts US, 335 gigawatts India, 1,500 gigawatts China. So what does that tell you? Simply that in order for China and India to have the same standard of living, same, access to the internet, Starbucks everywhere, whatever brand you want to pick, and, services and, hospitals everywhere, and sort of, the formula that we have created, right or wrong, everybody's going after that formula. So India would need to increase their production capacity tenfold, from 335 gigawatts to 3,000 gigawatts. So how are they going to do it? Coal plants, nuclear plants? I hope not, right? So when I sat with the minister and many people 2 years ago, I said, you got to go renewable right away, which will prevent you from buying oil from overseas and spending, the billions of dollars that you give away to other people that make that oil. If you switch to renewable, then you're spending money in your own country, creating jobs in your own country, and generates taxes and so on and so on. The Chinese, on the same token, need to double up. They need to go from 1,500 gigawatts to 3,000 gigawatts to get to the level that we are. So they're all going there, and the challenge that we have with CO2 elimination is that how do we go do it? So I have one single thing to add, and then I'll shut up and we can talk about another million things related to this, from energy storage to virtual power plants to everything in between. But if you take the electric vehicle, just one item, and I would say, Elon Musk, truly of the three things that he picked, the Tesla project is the most successful one. He picked the right thing to make a difference. But there are 260 million registered cars in the United States. If you make them all Teslas, just let's fantasize for a moment, and you make them all PD 100s, which means they have a 100 kilowatt hour battery each. You multiply 260 million Teslas times 100 kilowatts, that gives you 26,500 gigawatts. So if all those cars were electric, we could actually store the production capacity of the United States 26.5 times in one day. We wouldn't need any more power plants. We wouldn't need, you know, all kinds of things, right? So this is the interesting thing of what's happening. And so the electric vehicle, it's really the game changer, in my opinion. We thought of it in 2004 in terms of creating the market, went to the car companies, started begging to get electric vehicles, did a deal with Toyota back in the day. The Prius was invented. And so the electric vehicle, in my opinion, if there's one thing that we should get right and we should do anything it takes to make it successful, it should be the electric vehicle. So I'll stop.
Great. Well, you know, that was tantalizing. I mean, I know you could go on literally for hours, but this is a subject that I think is kind of really fascinating. I mean, tell us about what smart grid is, because most of us have never heard the word, and you would love to hear a little bit more about your view of the evolution of, first of all, how big a deal is power generation from the standpoint of the global energy crisis and CO2 global warming. I understand it's at least 25%, according to
you know, the electric cells market in the let's talk U.S. So in the U.S. market is $410 billion electricity sales, and that's basically broken up 17% to residential 38% residential market, 36% commercial, 25% industrial. And then there's a tiny little, you know, asterisk about transportation. And so comparing that to the oil and gas business, for example, in the same United States, the United States sales of oil and gas is only $186 billion compared to the $410 billion, right? But the electric sector is only responsible for 25% of the pollution of CO2. So we're 4 times or 2 times bigger, but we're only responsible for 25%, where the transportation sector it's actually double in CO2 production of CO2 versus our sector. So again, if you take the electric vehicle and you just shift of the 40 million cars made every year, roughly, if you make half of them electric, our CO2 problems would go away within 5 years, right? So there's certain elements that tend to come back to this theme, right? So the smart grid, to answer James' first question, is really, when you look at my career, I worked in the software industry, went to the computer industry, went to the telco industry, and then went to the energy industry. So the smart grid is basically a power grid that is using telecommunications, computers, and software to reinvent itself. And instead of being supply side, utility scale generation, to a grid that is non-instrumented at the edge, because, you know, power was too cheap to meter, and still is too cheap to meter in many places. That, you know, when you have a two-way power flow, you need a two-way data flow in real-time communications, so that you can have solar panels and electric vehicles and energy storage and smart appliances to do demand response on steroids, what some people call virtual power plants at the edge of the grid. And so as we're transitioning from, again, decentralization, from an industry that is primarily controlled by a few companies, I call them the 6 horsemen of the apocalypse: GE, Siemens, ABB, Eaton, Schneider, and I forget the 6th one. It'll come to me in a moment.
That's good enough.
That those companies have built the grid in a proprietary nature, like the computer world, and that's all shifting, right? So for example, we are doing a project with a couple of companies where we're reinventing the substation of the future, and we're creating a 1 megawatt, you know, never-ending 24/7 renewable energy power plant. That includes energy storage and other technologies. And so we are going to see, just like we saw the computer and the personal computer and the smartphone emerge in our lifetime, we are going to see a transformation where eventually you'll go to Walmart or your favorite supermarket and you'll buy a jug of energy, and you put it in your car or in your motorcycle or in your airplane, and this is all you need. And we'll make, billions of jugs of these things. And so you can, not have to worry about being connected and having wires everywhere and so on. Nevertheless, the wires are an important technology to own and master today, because we're moving again from a time of, centralized production of energy to distributed, and how you manage that and the math behind that. And to be honest with you, we don't today have all the answers, especially on the math side, on what it's called transformational differential equations, which are basically differential equations that learn from each other on how you manage a grid real time without human beings intervening in the middle, as you're managing billions of devices and they're all, talking and islanding and reshuffling each other to maintain the 50 hertz or the 60 hertz balance of the electricity.
Well, let me jump in. You mentioned the other day a Microsoft, just to catalyze this. I have a whole slideshow on the dire crisis and how we're running out of time. And we could talk about that a lot, but I think the bottom line is we're in deep shit here. So,
well, I went to Microsoft.
Talk about the Microsoft study.
Yeah. I went to Microsoft at a conference in February. We're doing a lot of stuff with R&D with them. And obviously Microsoft R&D is focused on AI, artificial intelligence, for obvious reasons, right? So their software. I sat in a presentation from the Vice President of Sustainability at Microsoft, where the sharing was very open about their corporate goals, which have been stated since January of this year. So Microsoft has done a lot of studying about what's going on with climate change. And the one slide is very simple. They say that there is a 60%, 66% probability that in the next 10 years, okay, as we are adding 2 billion people to the planet as well, that we will cross a line, there's no return back. And the amount of CO2 that needs to be created between now and then to cross that line is 420 gigatons. 420 gigatons. So it sounds like an incredible amount of CO2, but it's not really, because again, we're roughly creating 42 gigatons every year. And so if we don't change what we're doing, according to Microsoft, and I have no reason to doubt my professional alma mater, we have 10 years to figure it out. So my answer to all this, electric vehicles, electric vehicles, electric vehicles, electric vehicles.
Good. All right. Well, I guess that's a sort of a positive. And
so the one thing about it, Jim, that is really important is Microsoft made a statement, a commitment in January of this year, where they said that they're going to be carbon neutral by 2030 as a company, and they're going to be carbon negative, erasing the entire generation of, or the entire history of the carbon that they generated since they were founded in 1975. So by 2050, they would have repaired, or equivalently repaired by funding farms and planting trees and what have you. They would have repaired all that CO2 carbon footprint all the way to 1975, and they've given themselves a few years to do that. So the private sector, I heard something about the billionaires in the private sector, and Bill Gates and Melinda, you would argue, you could argue all you want about what a great job they're doing on that, but Bill is doing also a tremendous amount of quiet job on energy investing and next technologies, because again, the challenge that we have here is not one about you know, again, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a political science expert. To me, this is all about the fact that we had created a construct on how life is birthed and grown and supported for humans that is unsustainable. And it goes back to the fundamentals of engineering and physics and science and chemistry and all that. And everything else is kind of, you know, you can pick your battles on whatever, however the world gets manipulated. But if you don't know, don't know how to feed 2 billion people, then there will be more coronaviruses at a plague, because, you know, a lot of people will have to die if you can feed them, and, you know, God knows what's going to be the consequences of that. So there's all these fundamental science challenges that I love, and that's my contribution and my drive to this whole conversation.
Finally, one question that kind of bridges the gap. There are cartels, I guess you'd describe, that are standing in the hallway here, the elephants in the hallway. Would you agree that the fossil fuel subsidies ought to go? And
no mature industry should have any subsidies. Right. It's mind-boggling to me that not only that we have subsidies, that we allow them, but that we have the system that we have when it comes to the way the lobbyists control what's going on, and the votes are bought, and the way campaigns are done. And I mean, you know, that's just ridiculous. I mean, all it takes is a sixth grader to figure out that the whole thing is rigged.
What about the utility industry? Are they supporting smart grids, or are they?
Oh yeah. The smart grid journey is you know, the genie's out of the bottle. You know, happy to have created that in 2003. You know, we have helped about 25 utilities over the last 4 years to do their journey. There are probably, you know, smart grid projects in about, you know, we have 3,300 power utilities in the U.S. There are roughly globally about 4,000 total, including us. So there's, you know, there is roughly probably some, you know, 2,500 projects worldwide, in one way or another. They're all reinventing themselves, but it's not cheap. So, for example, walk away with this thinking: if we want to replace of the 1,100 gigawatts all the fossil fuel generation and turn it into wind and solar, we would have to invest. The cost of that would be, at today's dollars, basically $4 per gigawatt. I mean, per watt, I'm sorry, $4 per watt. It would be roughly $30 trillion just to go from no more CO2 to 100% green on the generation side alone, without adding any more capacity. So this is not a cheap proposition. And that's just the US number. Just this. So we are, you know, we have roughly 25% capacity of the globe. So, you know, so that number is 4 times bigger worldwide. And so, you know, how do you pay for that? And so again, what needs to happen is, just like we take for granted that we buy this new phone every 2 years because it gets cheaper and better, that this mind thinking of innovation needs to be translated to everything else that we make, especially in the industrial sector. So we should not be paying more, we should be paying less for the latest and greatest technology, and that curve should never stop, right? And so the question is, how do we get there, and how do we do that?
Gail, do you have a question for Andres?
I guess it's a bit more of a comment, if that's okay. I mean, there was a lot of information there, and if I'm honest, it's like nearly 10:30 here. I'm sorry. No, it's fine. I just mean I'm not sure I totally got everything. I wanted to say something firstly about climate science, this idea that there's any carbon budget left. I don't believe it myself from looking at climate science. I'm guessing, because it sounds like it, that Microsoft's figures came from the IPCC, a very respectable body, obviously, but what they are is the backstop, in my opinion, on the science. They don't integrate all of the data because they have to base on consensus and the process that takes time to build the data. Now, AR6 is coming out, I think, this September. It will include more climate tipping points. So David King, who's a former chief scientist in the UK, I made that point to him, agreed with me, and as did Professor Kevin Anderson. When the ice is already melting and you're getting climate tipping points like the albedo effect already kicking in, there isn't a budget, right? I don't think, I think we've got to take carbon out of the atmosphere. And so when I did appreciate what Microsoft came up with, I think that's good to sort of set about, a bar for companies. But when they give themselves targets of 2050, so much of this is based on the idea that we can suck carbon back out of the atmosphere at some point in the future. We're already breaching tipping points, so we have to do things a lot faster.
So again, let's not confuse two things. Microsoft corporate goals of decarbonizing their own historical footprint takes them to 2050. But they have said at the same time that the planet only has 10 years.
It calls it 6 tomorrow and
Thursday. I understood
Tomorrow's
that.
Those are two separate things. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I think the other thing is electric vehicles have come with a massive carbon footprint, frankly. And then when you're thinking about battery technologies, where does all the precious metals come from and so on, the idea that we can just take everything that we do now and recreate it with electric, like where's all these natural resources coming from, which mountain tops are we removing to get the minerals and so on? Do the indigenous people whose land belongs to them agree with that happening? I mean, there are many issues of equity and ecological justice baked into this, and nature is part of our solution here. Nature is the biggest technology. Nature knows how to do carbon capture and storage, right? And I know this is just what you're talking to, Andres, but regenerative agriculture puts a lot more carbon in the soil than other forms of agriculture. So there are other things that we need to look at rather than just like purely focusing on technology. Another figure is that 50% of emissions come from 10% of the population. It's a consumer issue, and it's a rich people's issue, and it's an issue of people who do a lot of flying and a lot of eating of meat and that kind of stuff. So I'm not talking about changing consumer behavior as a simple thing, but there's something in the COVID crisis where we've all doing this instead of flying to meet each other that's given us some clues about some of the shifts that we need to do in lifestyle. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to sort of raise a balance point that's talking both about nature and about justice in terms of materials that are going to be needed and carbon emissions for creating electric vehicles and things like that.
Andres?
I would say you have to pick your battles. So if we only have 10 years to save the planet from crossing the line on CO2 production, I would say the electric vehicle is the answer. So if we want to go back to being Amish, that's fine, but again, that's a bigger selling job when it comes to the population at large. So again, I'm just coming at this from the engineering point of view.
There is this interesting idea that Microsoft, it's a kind of reparations in a way. Do you think corporations are going to more broadly sign up for such a thing?
I would suspect that after Microsoft has done it, it may take a while for people to react, just like the first time that Bill Gates went to Warren Buffett and said, hey, I'm going to create the largest charity in the world, and I'm going to give all my money away for society to do better. And it took a few years for the other billionaires to catch on. But I think ultimately what Microsoft has put a stake in the ground that I think is a pretty impressive stake. If everybody were to follow Microsoft, that would help quite a bit on the journey of getting rid of CO2. So.
Excellent. Other questions for Andres? Mitchell?
Always me. It's always me. I do have a question. So something in another class I'm in, Energy Technology and Society with Daniel Prober, we talk a lot about a lot of the issues that you raised. How do you think there's a technological solution to grid integration in order to be able to harness like offshore wind and things like that on a more nationwide scale? Is that a technology question or is that a political question?
Yeah, I think that again, we're trying to attack a system that is unsustainable. So I'll answer it with this. You know, Tesla and Edison had two different approaches to how to build these grids. One was direct current, the other one was alternate current. Alternate current won for the right reasons at the time. It was Samuel Insull who made it happen by creating the business model of the future back then in the early 1900s, when he got the city of Chicago to buy in and giving him a 100-year franchise contract for providing electricity for the city of Chicago. And his monopoly was called Commonwealth Edison, or ComEd these days. And so you know, AC makes a lot of sense when you have centralized power plants that nobody wants in their backyards in the middle of nowhere, and you run those wires as far as you can so that people can have the pleasure of electricity. But the answer to our problems is really not more larger power plants and more wires everywhere. The answer to our problem is really decentralized generation, which is co-located with the load. So just like we do when we're in a farm or somewhere else, you should have your own generation capacity for your own consumption right in the premise. So again, there will be a use case that will come soon. There's a company called Rivian out of Plymouth, Michigan, backed by Amazon and Ford Motor Company, who is making the truck of the future. And you'll be able to run your whole house from your truck after you charge your truck at work for free, and then come home and drive home and plug the truck into the house, and the house runs from the truck, and you never pay electricity anymore at home. So you know, we need to rethink and reinvent how we're getting all these benefits and this quality of life. And just because we are afraid of perhaps technology or not understanding how we go about destroying the current world, if you want to use that word, and rebuilding on top of it, that we have to really be brave about embracing technology and kind of unleashing it beyond what we're thinking that it can do today. Because, you know, in my humble opinion, the answer to our solutions are technology based.
Thanks very much for that. Gail has mentioned a website that we should all look up, which is called Project Drawdown. There's a couple of Californian guys who are involved in producing this thing, but it's an excellent list of sort of detailed proposals, and includes a lot of the nice thing about it is it really quantifies a lot of different ideas for you know, sort of actually getting on with this, of which smart grid is an important one. But thank you, Andres, and let's give everyone a great round of applause, and then we'll turn to Gabriel for some thoughts about South Africa. All right. Now, Gabriel, it's yours for the next few minutes, and then we're going to talk about, you know, I think conclude this, because we've had a lot of disparate contributions here, but you know, I'm hoping that the intersection has been useful.
Great. So I suppose let me start with a preface. I remember doing an environmental ethics seminar with Peter Singer at Princeton University when I was an undergraduate there in 2012. And I remember hearing about third world countries. This is obviously in America, and the challenges they face. And it was very easy for me, even as a South African from that point of view, to think, well, this is a global crisis. Everyone has to pull their weight. They must just get in line, behave like America, behave like Europe ought to behave, cut down immediately. I suppose since coming back to South Africa, I've had to have a rethink. But let me give you a bit of detailed history in South African energy production. So before World War II, we had a racist system set up, but a relatively progressive government leader, Jan Smuts, helped in big ways with the League of Nations, United Nations. Under him, the energy grid was nationalized under the wicked and stupid system of apartheid. It has grown. And by 1994, when the ANC took over, South Africa had huge excess energy production capacity and the cheapest electricity in the world. By 1996, there'd been a lot of new appointments made into Eskom, which is the name of our power utility, bringing in people who'd previously been blocked from doing that. A lot of great additions. And our power utility was rated as one of the top 5 in the world. Super cheap, super effective, super coal heavy. And there was some nuclear. South Africa has the distinction of being the only country, as far as I know, that decommissioned its nuclear weapons, but the nuclear power generation remained. Okay, that was the good old days. You go from the 90s to the 2000s, Eskom rolls out electricity to millions, tens of millions of new homes. Power capacity penetration goes up into the high 90% for most provinces. These are people who previously had to, their kids had to try and study by candlelight. Okay, more good news. But at the same time, there's a problem. And the problem is the introduction of legislation that is designed to do affirmative action for Black people, but an explicit policy to exploit that, to deploy people into the energy sector on the basis of ideology. And this is made explicit in the early 2000s by the then President Thabo Mbeki. So you can think about this as a race thing, but I think it would be better to think of it as an ideology thing. And as one really good example, there's a colleague that I mentioned in a previous, someone that I've worked with that I mentioned in the last class, the seminar that I came to visit, who was an MK veteran, who was trained in East Germany as an engineer, partly to blow up things like power stations, but also to be able to step in when the time comes to run these things. Omri Matwale. He was in Eskom. He was one of the early cadres deployed on the basis of his skills. But by the mid-2000s, he's kicked out of Eskom because his ideology, insofar as he has one, is like, we need to produce effective power for people to be able to use it. And the ideology that's taken over is value grab. So he's muscled out, along with many others. There's huge retrenchments of the most skilled workers, huge introductions of ideological workers. Jacob Zuma takes over the presidency in 2008. He's blatantly corrupt. And under him, under his last decade, as we call it, roughly from 2008 to 2017, the staff at Eskom goes up by 50%, from roughly 30,000 to more than 45,000. The wage, the median wage, goes up drastically, much higher than inflation. It's one of the best paid places to work as a utility in the world, despite our kind of third world status. And at the same time, relative to purchasing power parity, and at the same time, production goes up 0. Costs to the South African consumer go up 300%, more than 200% in inflation-adjusted terms. So poor South Africans are paying more money to get the same amount of maximum capacity electricity with a huge inflated wage bill. And the result of that is we now have greater demands upon our electricity grid than our ability to provide. And because of that, starting in 2008, rolling on to today, we've had severe, what we call load shedding, which is when parts of the grid are just shut off for anything from 2 hours to weeks. And that's the way of the government saving production. You speak to any South African, and you know that this is a huge contributor, I guess, in a way, to inequality, because if you're really well off, you can burn your own diesel in a generator to supply your little community or to supply your office space. But for people in the middle classes and the lower classes, it's a nightmare when you don't have electricity. Your fridges turn off, you can't cook food, you can't work, you can't socially, it's a real disaster, because when the townships are dark, what we call townships are dark. Crime rates clearly spike. Rapes, murders, it's not great. Okay, so that's kind of the hole that we dug ourselves into. One of the ways we thought we'd get out of that hole was producing lots of nuclear. There was deals trying to be cracked in secret by President Zuma and the Russians, which had clear geopolitical strings attached of the kind that did not, I suppose, have the sufficient muster to pass scrutiny, which is why they were secret in the first place. And that was averted because Jacob Zuma was finally replaced and his chosen heir was not the person to step into his shoes. So why does this matter? Okay, GDP is a rough number. I agree with Gail's point here. It doesn't capture a lot of what makes life worth it. But it is a really important commensurable unit, as the philosophers call it, of what kinds of capacity you have for sustainable life standards improvements. And our GDP has a ceiling above it of 2% growth based on our energy incapacities. And South Africa is a hugely underdeveloped place. We have 1.7 million children with stunted growth because of malnutrition. We have 3.7 million children with anemia due to malnutrition. And I can go on listing various really poor indicators about my country. And there's no way to get out of that without getting more resources. And I suppose one way to get more resources, more charity or more redistribution from the rest of the world. But the only sustainable way to do it, that's dignified in my opinion, is for us to be more productive, and we can't do that because of our energy incapacities. So now let's turn to the green solution versus the kind of status quo, very coal heavy problem that we have. The coal heavy problem that we have, we're worse than coal because of the screw ups at Eskom. We've been using diesel more than any country in the world, which is even worse. Both cost-wise and pollutants-wise, to plug the gaps because of the super subsidized coal contracts and the poor quality of coal. There's huge vested political interest there behind a kind of black consciousness ideological fig leaf. And on the other hand, you've got the green movement. The green movement seems appealing to us, particularly because of the decentralization that was mentioned earlier. When you've got a very corrupt system, one hope is if you can decentralize power generation, then you can circumnavigate a lot of the vested interests that are trying to squeeze efficient value add out of the system for personal value grab. The thing is, our IPPs, our independent power producers that are very green, they charge 222 cents per rand overall in the last audited fiscal year per kilowatt hour. These are South African rands, whereas Eskom costs about 77 cents per kilowatt hour, South African rands. Roughly 20 to 1 the rand to the dollar at the moment. So what that means is green energy costs us at the moment 3 times more. And if you break it down by when the bids were placed for these independent power producers and when they've come into effect, and the bids that have been placed that haven't come into effect yet, we're looking at the bids that have been awarded but haven't started to generate. When they do and they start plugging into our system, their costs are going to be 7 times more. So this is a nightmare for South Africa because we are deep in a debt trap. We have a financial system where 10 million formally employed workers are, through our highly redistributive tax system, subsidizing social grants for 16 million people. So if you kind of switch off our economy, you're switching off food in a very immediate way to more than 10 million people. And that is what would most likely happen if our energy costs ramped up to go from the kind of coal costs to the green costs if we did that very hastily. And part of the reason for that is that our coal costs are inflated because of the ideological fig leaves behind which you can have kleptocracy, the kind of nasty fake capitalism that we all worry about. But that also plays out in the green movement. Not the green movement, in the green producers. So this leaves us in a real dilemma where it seems like we're damned on both ends. And that makes it very difficult to think about what the right approach is. Now, Jim and I have worked with some really stellar people at independent investigators who've done a good job of trying to kind of prick the little bubbles of super economic profit where they arise, particularly with the nuclear deal. Daily Maverick did a really great job of busting out that plot to make it not happen. And they continue to do that good work. So one thing you can do is when you catch a crook, like point him out and hope that he gets punished as a result. But in terms of what kinds of positive proposals one can make, I think we're in the kind of situation where it does seem appropriate to say you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And I don't think that's like helpful. If I was I work effectively for a lobby group, and if I was trying to do some lobbying here, I probably would try to figure out something else to say. Part of the reason I haven't done any lobbying around climate science is I don't know what else to say in this country. But speaking to kind of academics and students, I suppose it's best to put it like it is. I think that if South Africa moves very green very fast, we will have just another reason for investors, domestic and local, to flee, and that will have very direct consequences on tens of millions of people who rely on our economic activity. And I mean the most dire consequences. I'll go back to the malnutrition rates of our children in this country. It is deadly serious. But if we don't pull our weight, then it's as if we're freeloading. It's as if we're expecting you in America, having had your Microsoft moments and having had your Apple moments and your GMs and so on, to say, okay, well, you've gotten the gains. Can you please take the pain while we continue to do what we're doing? And I must caution you, this is exactly the argument that was being made by a Chinese top official at the Peter Singer class I was at Princeton. He said, China's prepared to come to the party, but only after America has put in a couple of decades of major carbon reductions, because the only reason your economies are where they are is because you've already had decades, if not centuries, you and Europe ahead of us in terms of being allowed to get the most cost-effective way of going about this. So that's
that poses the global justice question directly. What is there a constituency for transforming the green, the state of South Africa's economy to a green basis? And is there a plan that anybody has costed out for doing that? I mean, I know that the IPP contracts are lousy, but that shouldn't rule out, taking a fresh, clean sheet of paper and saying, what if we had electric vehicles? What if we had, a lot more solar? Because in principle, I mean, no place is better set up to do solar and wind and, geothermal than South Africa. I mean, you're blessed with all this stuff and kind of cursed by the coal.
Yeah. No, I think that's very well put. I have looked at a few models. They've been so different that I've struggled to see the science through the ideology. But I think looking at international comparisons, it does look like we could be way more effective than we are, and that if we were effective, we could dig ourselves out of this hole. But I suppose in a sense, I'm a political realist. Like I find the thought that we've got two problems. One problem is we're very poor. The other problem is that we've got a very, very poor democracy. It's extremely weak. Like Jim and I sometimes clash about this, like America, your guys' democracy hasn't been weaker in my lifetime. but like my democracy hasn't been at its strongest, as strong as your guys' democracy is now at your weakest. And we are far from our strongest. We are so far from it. So it requires it requires the rule of law. It requires a free press. It requires an informed and activated population to resist the temptations of value grab, whether it's coming from the coal movement or the green movement. Let me say one more thing about the green movement. We do have, I think, one of the more kind of anecdotally interesting things about it is that at the moment in South Africa, it's not legal, but it is physically possible to put a solar generator, to put a solar panel, gather energy in your house, and feed it back into the grid. And you will literally have that cost deducted. It's like a loophole. It shouldn't be like this, but it works. You have the cost deducted of what you're putting back into the grid from what you charged. And I know I have interviewed over a dozen people who do that. If you just have one household, it's not going to get you very far. But if you're renting out, or you have, if you've got a house and 3 Airbnbs and you're feeding back into those and they're not always being used, or you have a sophisticated apartment block setup, then you can really come out on zero. And that's, it's hard to tell what the extent of that is right now, but I think it's much larger than any of the indications. And in a more organized way, you have communities from suburban to municipal to provincial level in the Western Cape, which is the one province that's run by the opposition government. You've got major pushes to try, they've actually managed, they were suing at the Supreme Court of the Western Cape and finally applied enough pressure that legislation has been passed for them to be allowed to decentralize energy production to an extent. And the great hope there is that they will be doing a lot of that in a green way. So there are moments of progress, but I think in the bigger scheme of things, they kind of pale in comparison to the challenges we face from Gwede Mantashe, who's our Minister of Energy and has done a really poor job, and literally he's such a fool, our minister, that he went to Australia saying, you guys are a bunch of racists because we've got this magical newly discovered mineral in South Africa that's really good for energy production. It's a great catalyst. It'll save the world's problems, but you haven't come to mine it from us because you just don't think we can come up with new stuff. It turns out that he got that story from a fake news, like internet meme from Reddit. And he literally flew all the way to Australia to go and deliver that speech. Like his speechwriters, this was not an off-the-cuff remark in a press conference. This was a prepared thing. So he really doesn't know what he's talking about. And yet he's making these kinds of proposals. So Jim, to be perfectly honest with you, here's my hope. Electric cars, Elon Musk, my South African fellow, that's going to become a much bigger thing. I think that's a huge part of the mix. I think that nuclear energy in other parts of the world is a really good idea. I'm very disappointed in Germany's response. I'd love to hear some more from my other panelists about whether they kind of nuclear energy seems safe. Germany in particular seems an interesting case there. And to go back to Princeton, because I happened to mention it in the start, I was very glad to see that their plasma laboratory was reopened after kind of 10 years of degradation. And their new chief there thinks that nuclear fusion is viable in my lifetime. And it's a very, it's the kind of thing that capitalists are going to like. It doesn't require a reduction in consumerism. It doesn't require a change in the way we think about markets and democracies and so on. So it might not satisfy everyone, but it would reduce the energy costs, the safety, and geopolitical costs radically, were it to work. And I'd like to see more funding go into that, because it's the kind of thing which, if it doesn't work, that's a problem. But if it does work, it'd be a pity if we end up making it work too late. And I think ITER and Princeton and other very seriously credible kind of institutions have some faith in it, and so do I. I suppose if I can put a question to your students to think about, it would be sort of expanding from the South African context, which is a very small microcosm, which is so corrupt that it might seem like it has no relevance outside, to thinking about the concurrent crisis with the COVID crisis, which is the oil price war. And part of what's going on there is that a lot of the OPEC countries, OPEC plus, Russia included, have very inefficient markets because they're very state-run. America has a very innovative market because it's heavily subsidized, but it's got competition. And so fracking developments have been great. And America has just managed to, I think, punish its arch foes in the Russians in a way that hasn't happened in probably more than a decade by getting Russia to agree to new reductions in their production that are much less stringent than they would have been if they just agreed with the Saudis originally a little while back. Now, part of why this is interesting is because the reduction in oil prices, if you're agreeing, that's your worst nightmare, I assume, because cheap oil is going to bamboozle all of the best arguments that you have. So you want expensive oil. But look at what it takes to get it. It takes, even beyond Congresses, it takes international executive, nasty, tough, aggressive geopolitics, very realist, very realpolitik kind of interventions. And in this case, not, I think, motivated by interest in preserving the global ecology. But if you wanted to harness those kinds of tools to put pressure on other governments to get the kind of coordinated intergovernmental action that you're going to need, you know, that's a paradigm that's quite hard to occupy, but one worth entertaining.
Great. We have time for one question from Christian. You're holding back here.
You know, my question relates to whether the current pandemic, which many people believe is a result of more and more intrusions into nature, and how, you know, if you're going to have 2 billion more people in another decade or two, further encroach on nature, which will make the climate crisis even worse. And I'm wondering if this present pandemic, which has forced everyone into a state of questioning about the state of the world, can provide an impetus or a boost to the whole awareness of the climate disaster that we are facing. And if there's a connection that we can make logically between the pandemic and the climate crisis, that will make an impact in the public mind that could perhaps create some major policy differences after COVID-19 is over.
Good point.
If I can address that, because I just brought up the international perspective, international relations idea. You know, I think that from like a common citizen point of view, it does seem like COVID is an interesting phenomenon. It's like the alien that descends on the human race, and you think the human race can unite to combat that. And if we have a more united zeitgeist, we might be able to harness that sense of collaboration to mitigate externalities. And pandemic mitigation is totally about, like, it's not about me, it's about what I can do to other people. That's why you need to have a lockdown, because of how I might impact others. I'm pretty good at managing my own risk, but I'm not pretty good at managing my risk of infecting others. So I agree that that's kind of very, it's deeply impressed into most people's minds right now, and that could be harnessed. But on the other hand, one of the things my colleagues and I was just on another conference call with America before this one, you know, it does look to me like Chimerica, insofar as it existed, is coming apart. And the developments in China of to a degree mitigating their new coal production, and at the very least increasing solar production at very large scales, you know, that was part of one of the few good news stories from a large state perspective, particularly in in line with what I was saying earlier. And that seemed to fit into the broad Chimerica kind of way of going about things. America and China's international relations, I think, are even cooler now than they were at the worst of the trade war. And I think that as the COVID crisis unfolds, a lot of people, particularly on the right in America, are going to find it energizing to hold China responsible for the virus's spread. And there's little doubt in my mind that the Communist Party in China did not report faithfully and honestly in best faith in January on the matter. But I think that I'm not trying to justify the kinds of reactions that I expect to come, which I think will be outsized. China, at the same time, I think is very fed up with America bullying it. So I think if you have a breakdown between Beijing and Washington in trade, in general geopolitical attitudes, if you've got kind of cruise ships pushing through the Straits of Japan and kind of bullying each other in that kind of way, that might be the more important factor in terms of trying to get collaboration going in the face of the environmental problem. So I think there's a real possible downside here.
I think the importance of Christian's point is that the pandemic is for many people a teachable kind of moment. They may learn the wrong things from it, that try to hold China responsible. I think that's ridiculous. But the overall opportunity here to see the importance of government and state action and community values and, being, your own welfare dependent on whether the landscaper down the street has got the virus, these common wealth community kind of aspects of wealth that we often forget about, and in our quest for private fortunes. So I don't know. I think that there's no question about that. This has opened up a lot of possibilities to people who are, I think, erstwhile conservatives. Many of them are re-examining their values right now. But I want to thank you, Gabriel. That was really insightful, and I think it made clear to me just how critical it is for developing countries to get this balance right and to try to have an intelligent green strategy in the face of all this confusion and the subsidies that we're throwing at the oil industry. And you really have inherited a mess from us. Well, I think, Thomas, do you want to have the last word here in terms of you're muted. You're mute. Yeah.
Sorry for that. I don't know the last word. It was a great session, and I think we should just get prepared for the next one. Thank you, everybody, and see you all next week.
Great. All right. Thanks very much. Regards to Gabriel. Thanks for tuning in. It's late there. Thanks, everyone. Good. All right.
Thank you very much for your time.
To be continued. Thank you.